Ted Hoyt here with Veterans Remember. I'm happy to have Dick Gooding, a longtime host of Veterans Remember, joining us today to tell us a little bit about his history and his military background. Dick, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ted. I appreciate the invite. And it is a little bit different being on this side of the camera rather than, or the interview chair rather than being the interviewee. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity. As you know, I was born in Needham and moved to Hopkinton as a 6-year-old lad in first grade after my mom moved up from Needham after the passing of my dad at age 38. Grew up in Hopkinton. It was a different town. It was 3,000 people in Hopkinton at the time I grew up, and a lot simpler. I don't want to say a lot more fun, but it seemed to be at the time. You knew everybody else in the town, and we were just happy as we could be. I've had the opportunity to represent the school a few times in things that we were involved in high school, and naturally it led to having the opportunity to go to West Point, which I did back in 1963. My mom and I and my stepdad at the time had looked at different places for me to go, and I had applied to a few colleges. Brown, at the insistence of Aubrey Doyle, who at that time was our offensive line coach, or the line coach at Hopkinton High, and a longtime Brown alumni, and all of his boys went to Brown. Bowdoin, which was a friend of our family, was on the board of directors on there. And then Worcester Polytech, which is probably the school I thought I was going to go to because I dreamed of being an engineer. West Point became big into my thought process around my junior year in high school. And when I was interested in going to the Naval Academy, because Joe Bellino had just won a Heisman Trophy with the Naval Academy, and that seemed to be a neat place to go. And my uncle, who was a real mentor for me from Needham, had an in with on the naval side of it, so I thought maybe there would be a good opportunity to get an appointment. That's when I found out my vision was less than 20/20, and back in '62 when we were applying, that was a disqualifying factor for the Naval Academy. So I said, well, gee, let's try Army. And that's how I suddenly became enamored with West Point and went through that interview process, and off I went.
And Dick, did you have family that had been in the military?
Just my uncle. My dad, who, as I mentioned, died back in 1948, was an electrician at the Watertown Arsenal. And so he was exempt from going into the military because he was doing a military function. So he didn't serve. My uncle, my mom's only brother, was in Korea, and he was a pilot. And so he was the one that probably got me interested in pursuing an academy appointment. And he was, he was probably more of a father figure than anything else.
Now, was he a Navy pilot?
He was a Marine pilot.
Okay.
And I'm confused somewhat about how they differed back then, because there was the Army, Air Force, the Air Force, and the same thing but he was a Marine pilot, yeah.
Okay, so you went to West Point.
Yes.
And what was the process to get admitted there at the time?
Well, you had to go through a number of tests. I'd wind up at the Boston Army base to do a physical test. You had to take a competitive examination to get a political appointment. Then, and I assume now, each congressman had one appointment a year, and each senator had one appointment a year. and it was very competitive, and each of them had set up their own criteria for selection. And I remember going, Teddy Kennedy was a junior senator back then, and I remember going into Boston to take a test with 300 or 400 of my closest friends, all competing for his one appointment.
Wow.
So I knew I wasn't going to get his, and I ultimately wound up getting first alternate appointment from Harold Donahue, who represented Worcester, and we were part of that back in that time in '62, and so I got a first alternate appointment, and then got in because they horse trade with places who don't use up all their appointments, and typically the big northeastern states, New York, West or Massachusetts, Connecticut, wind up getting more than their normal allotment. So I got in that way. I found out I got my appointment, and then found out I was qualified to get in, and then I just saw through the process at that point.
And you said it's very competitive. Were you very gifted academically? Did you do a lot of sports? How did that work?
A little bit of both. I was a very good student. Again, in a slower time and less demanding time, probably academically, in the schools, which I found out as soon as I got to West Point, and I was up against some of these brilliant guys in my class. And I say guys, I don't mean that with any disrespect to the women, but we didn't have women at West Point back in 1963. And I played sports. I played football, basketball, and baseball. Baseball was my best sport, and was I would say I was on their list, not necessarily being heavily recruited, but I was on the baseball list, which I'm sure played some part of the acceptance process.
And did you play baseball at West Point?
Yes, I did. Had the opportunity to play under Eric the Red Tipton, who was a very senior guy at that point, and had played in the Rose Bowl for Duke, and had been Army's baseball coach for 30 years, I guess it was, or 30 years or 25 years at the time. And I was hoping to play both pitching and first base. First base was my love. Pitching, I'm a left-hander, a little bit wild, so that was of interest to them because they like left-handed pitchers. And my plebe year, of course, back then, plebes couldn't play anything other than freshman ball. So my plebe year, I pitched probably every fourth day, and pitched about, I think about 9 games my plebe year, and which put me eligible to play varsity the next year. And I did. And had the opportunity to play with some really stellar athletes, a couple of whom are in the West Point Athletic Hall of Fame now, and had a unique opportunity as a young lad to play against the Mets and the Yankees. Every year the Mets and the Yankees would come up sometime during April when they had a break, and they'd come up and we'd play an exhibition game against the Mets and the Yankees. And probably a couple of highlights of that is in my sophomore year, as I was just getting onto the varsity, we were playing the Yankees, and I was come in as a relief pitcher, which was where I'd gone from being a starting pitcher as a plebe to a relief pitcher. I was pitching to Elston Howard, who was covering up for Yogi Berra, who was just either on the way out or maybe he was just being substituted. I forget exactly what. But Elston Howard, then I threw my best fastball right down the middle, and he whacked one that was on the rise after it had cleared the 385-foot mark and hit the facade of the officers' club on the other side of a road. And I'd never seen anything like that then and probably since. Yeah, and at the same time, or later that spring, we were playing against the Mets. And I was out in the bullpen where the two bullpens were right together, so you could talk with the players, and you were there. And I was warming up to go in, and again, I was left-hander. And who was out there in the bullpen but Warren Spahn, a Hall of Famer who played for the Braves here in Boston and was one of the greatest pitchers of all time. His last year, he was like an assistant coach and a pitcher for the Mets. And out in the bullpen where I was, and I was pitching, I don't know, trying to throw a sinker or whatever. And he came over and tried to correct me and told me you can get better spin on the ball if you do this. And I'm sitting there with my mouth agape with Warren Spahn. And I don't think I ever could learn how to pitch a sinker, but it was an experience I'll never forget.
Now, you say he was with the Mets, is that
Yes.
correct? So not the Yankees. The Yankees
Right.
were never friendly. They were always
Well,
mean.
they were. There wasn't anyone quite like him
I'm just
on,
joking.
on there.
We don't
Mickey Mantle. They were friendly, and they were all very friendly, and they played. They played everyone, but they usually started all of their starters, and they only know one way to go, and that's to go full speed, and they did.
Okay. Did you do any other sports there at West Point?
Yes, I played what's called now sprint football. I was a lot lighter than I am now, and sprint football was for people who weighed 154 pounds 2 days before the game. And most of us weighed 170 or 165 and had to sweat our way down to weigh-in day, and I played that. And I also ran track. I did the 60-yard indoor sprint as a plebe, and that gave me. And I made it as the third sprinter because there were only 3 guys trying out. So the other 2 who were legitimate sprinters were 1 and 2, and I qualified as number 3. And what that did is gave me an off-site trip with the team. The plebes had one off-site trip, and that year it happened to be to Harvard. So I got to go home, and that was quite an experience, except that was followed up with 2 false starts and a disqualification, so I didn't get to embarrass myself too badly by coming in last. I got disqualified instead.
Wow. And what about any extracurriculars or other sports?
Probably one of the things I had a lot more fun with, or as much fun doing, is broadcasting on the station there at West Point, which was called KDET. And we were broadcasting hockey games live, and they would do it on the road as well. And since I was from Boston and knew a lot of hockey, I didn't play it in high school because we didn't have the opportunity. We had no team. But they sort of liked somebody who actually knew the game to do the broadcast. So I was like the color man for KDT, and I got a trip back home, got to see my girlfriend, who I ultimately married, Judy Bowker, who from the Bowker family, a well-known old town name, had 13 children, I think it is, 7 sons and 6 daughters, and
her parents.
Her father was a Bowker, and most of them all served during the World War II and Korea. At one point there were 3 sons in Europe at the same time, and another one over in the Pacific, and
Wow.
quite a family lore.
And did any of them have any particular stories? I know.
Well, Judy's father, Cliff, served with General Patton, and he was a tank driver, and so he was not in the Battle of the Bulge, but he was there right afterwards, and
Wow.
and he said, "Boy, everyone got down on their knees when General Patton was on board, because he was a hell of a guy."
Presence. Okay. What about when you then joined the military? How did you start there?
I selected the field artillery for my branch. We had to have combat arm experience, and field artillery was the one that interested me the most for no apparent reason. It's not like I knew anything about guns or howitzers or anything like that. And selected my first assignment, and I was high enough up in the class where I got to pretty well got my first choice, although I was a middling in academically at West Point, and selected to go to Germany for my first assignment. And this was shortly after my wife and I married, which was 3 weeks after graduation. We got married in a military wedding right up here at St. John's, and which was quite an experience because I had a bunch of my classmates all flying around in flashy Corvettes who were my groomsmen, and it was quite a spectacle. So off we went to Germany as newlyweds, and first thing we did is we got picked up at the airport in Frankfurt by a staff car and some lieutenant, and said, "Okay, come on, we got to go back. You're going to be staying temporarily in the BOQ, the Bachelor's Officers' Quarters, you and your wife, and you'll be leaving as soon as we get back, Lieutenant Gooding, to go meet your unit in the field." And this was like the day before Thanksgiving. Wow. So off we went. I left my wife in the officers' club in Germany, 21 years of age, and off we went into the field. And then they bussed all the family up the next day, and we had turkey dinner in the Army style, which was a nondescript turkey to say the least. But we had a great time, and that was an experience I'll not forget.
So turkey dinner in the field.
Yeah.
So how would they do something like that?
Well, they bus them out, and we were in the field. We had there were roads to get to the various places you were, and so they were able to bring buses, a couple of buses worth of spouses out to the field to join us for Thanksgiving dinner.
Sorry, did they eat on the floor, or did they have
No.
tables? They had little tables.
We had tables, and
okay.
and I forget, we must have had folding chairs of some sort, but
so a little civilized.
Yeah, and in Germany, I was involved with what I thought was the field artillery, but really isn't, because I was in a nuclear weapons company, the Honest John, which is a ground-to-ground tactical nuclear weapon, and never was shot in earnest, thank the good Lord, but was available to the U.S. We had a number of Honest John batteries that were right on the Czech border and on the East German border back then, and our mission was to, in the event of an attack by the hordes, as we called them, which were the Russians at the time, I guess it was Russians at the time, not Soviets, but we were there to then delay them as they were getting all the families out of Germany.
So delay with nuclear weapons?
Yes, because they only
Wow.
went 50 miles was the maximum of them. And, curiously enough, we were on these 10 big trucks, and we'd throw these missiles. Well, that was what we would do, is we'd throw them up to 50 miles in advance, and only took a few seconds for the rockets to go 50 miles. And the warheads were like 5 times the size of the ones that were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And then we would have been left as cannon fodder on the way out. So we weren't delighted with that concept, but that's what we were.
What precautions did they take against like a commando raid to steal the nuclear weapons?
Well, the nuclear weapons, the warheads, were in earthen bunkers that they called URLAS, URLASS. I have no idea what that stands for, but it had something to do with, I think it was German. And there were a number of them in Germany. I'm not sure exactly how many. Ours was within 10 miles of where our unit was, our headquarters were. And they were supposed to be secret as to their location for the very reason you asked. They weren't very good in holding secrets, because it turns out when I first went out to check the nuclear warheads in our battery, out in my Jeep, I had a map, and we didn't have
GPS.
GPSs at the time. And I'm trying to find this place, which was out in the middle of a field somewhere. And a little German farmer came up to me, because I looked bewildered, and he says, "If you're looking for your URLAS, it's up here about a half a mile." But they were heavily guarded and had all sorts of concertina wire around it, and had prescribed action link PAL devices which locked the doors, which could only be opened when authenticated with authentication cards that we had and authentication cards that the President of the United States had.
Right.
Now, we had practice alerts where we could go out and do that, but the real alert would be that way, and then that would unlock the device and allow us the opportunity to put it in on our rockets.
So that wasn't it at the bunker. That was the device itself.
The device.
The device itself.
The bunker was, of course, locked with a heavily locked as well.
Okay. So after your experience with in Germany and with the Honest Johns, what did you do after that?
Well, I was curtailed. I was supposed to have a 3-year assignment. After a year and a half, they decided I should go across another ocean, and I got sent to Vietnam. And it was really just at the time I was being promoted to captain, or shortly before that. And we stopped in Fort Sill, Oklahoma for some training specific to Vietnam. And then off we went to Vietnam. I had my fresh, brand new captain's bars on me. Had nothing to do with knowledge of what I was getting into or any of the weaponry, because I didn't have Honest Johns in Vietnam, and that had been my only assignment. So my first time really with the artillery was in Vietnam, where I virtually had no experience.
Okay, and just was that an accompanied tour? Did your wife join you there in Vietnam?
No,
okay.
Vietnam was certainly not accompanied. She stayed back in Massachusetts, and at the time we had a son that was infant, and he wound up having the opportunity to meet me when he was about 9 months old. So that was kind of an experience too.
Okay, what did you do in Vietnam?
Well, in Vietnam, I was, again, I told you I was a captain wet behind the ears, and I got diverted by the G2, which is intelligence at the division level of the 4th Infantry Division, who was a West Pointer and had read my files. They pass the files around if you go there without a specific assignment. And he read my file and saw I was a West Pointer and had reasonably good grades, so he invited me to be interviewed. And he said, "Look, I'm looking for an intelligence officer to conduct daily intelligence briefings to the generals and their staffs. Would you have any interest?" And I said, "Well, sure I would." And I said, "But I know it's very important that I get to have an opportunity to command troops in the field as well, but certainly I'd be interested in that." And so I got selected to do that. And I can remember the first night I was in Pleiku, which is where the 4th Infantry Division was headquartered, in the Central Highlands, kind of a nasty area of Vietnam, although I guess they all were back then. And the first night we came under a mortar attack from just outside the wire into the camp, and so I spent about an hour and a half or 2 hours on my first evening huddled in a bunker, wondering whether I was going to make it through the first week. And fortunately, I weathered that storm and got the opportunity to spend time learning about the intelligence operations in Vietnam, as well as the general operations of our troops, and had the opportunity to meet a lot of generals.
Okay, so if I can just get a little better understanding of the intelligence briefings, would it be for just the 4th Infantry Division, or was it you were briefing the 4th Infantry Division about what was going on around
The
them?
latter. I was briefing 4th Infantry Division staff about what was going on in our theater of operations, 4th Infantry Division, as well as outside in different areas down the Mekong Delta, up in the demilitarized zone in the north. But it was primarily about what was going on in the Central Highlands, which was the area that we operated on.
So was the enemy, was the VC and the NVA, were they active there in the Central Highlands?
Very much so, particularly along the border area, which was about 40 miles west of where we were, maybe less than that. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the way that both troops and supplies infiltrated into South Vietnam, dumped out in the Central Highlands. And so we established Special Forces A camps, they call them, which were like forts meant to gather information and intelligence more than they were meant to get involved with heavy contact, up and down the western border of Vietnam. And I had a very close friend who was best man in our wedding up here in Hopkins, and I was best man in his. His name was Captain Doug Gray, the 4th. Was killed in a camp in a miserable place called Doc Peck, and so that was the area that we operated in. There was most of the activity, though, on the other side, the eastern side, was Viet Cong rather than North Vietnamese regulars. The North Vietnamese regulars tended to spend their time up both north of us in up near the border with North Vietnam, and then also down in the south.
Okay, you mentioned the Special Forces A camps.
Yeah.
And I've read about the Montagnards that were they active in your area as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit.
Many of the troops that were involved, and there weren't that many troops in each of the A camps, but they were protected primarily by Montagnards, which were indigenous people from that particular area, who were very good fighters, good troops, and they were trained by the Special Forces to work with the Special Forces troops up there. There would be regular troops and then a large number of Montagnard troops, so that they would be involved on a daily basis in the activities we had at these camps.
So watching the movies, sometimes it seems that some of the indigenous troops in Vietnam would sometimes be VC in disguise, but was that the case?
A little
possibly?
bit of that, but I don't think that was as common as it might have been.
But would it have been? Did it ever occur with the Montagnards specifically, or was that really more?
Not in my area while I was there. It's not to say that didn't happen, because it may well have happened. There were also Kit Carson Scouts was the name of Vietnamese, typically, who had turned from the VC to become part of our fighting effort, and who helped the troops learn where Vietnamese VC had infiltrated to, and they would work with the individual troops. I think more of them might have had that problem of being two-faced spies.
Yeah. So after your daily briefs, did you have any other tasks, any other jobs there in Vietnam?
Well, they were yes. After I left, after 6 months, I was transferred down to Division Artillery Headquarters of what was called the First Field Force, IFFV, Division Artillery in Nha Trang, which was along the China Sea, very nice seaside city, and with the idea that I was going to be assigned a firing battery to be the commanding officer of that firing battery. And before I got out there, I was intercepted again by an intelligence officer, the S2 of Division Artillery, and he saw that I had had experience handling briefing and doing intelligence activities with 4th Infantry Division. And so he asked the Division Artillery if they could keep me instead of sending me out to the field. And it was about that time that I'd made my decision that I was going to leave the service, when my commitment was up, and that the idea that I would defer the opportunity to command troops in combat wasn't as scary to me, so I accepted the opportunity to do the similar job at a lower level at Division Artillery Headquarters.
You say Nha Trang was on the South China Sea?
Yes.
Right? And so was that further away from like the Central Highlands? It sounded like that was a problem area.
It's outside of the Central Highlands. It was part of I don't want to bore you with, but two core operations, and it was right along the sea. Tended to have fewer major engagements than certainly Pleiku and other areas that I spent a little time in, which had more constant combat going on.
And was it engagements with, in this case, just the Viet Cong, because the North Korean?
Yes, the North Vietnamese didn't really make it that far out towards the sea, because that would cut their communication lines and make them too long, stretch them too much, and they would fear getting cut off and then getting massacred. So most of the North Vietnamese were along the borders of North Vietnam and Cambodia.
Okay. And was that your last assignment in Vietnam?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And a year to the day, I left my 1-year assignment and got assigned to support a 155 millimeter howitzer battery here in Massachusetts, in Boston. On my dream sheet, they called it, where you select where you'd like to go, I had written that I'd like to be involved with a civilian component unit in the Northeast, if at all possible. And typically when you wish for something, they give you something just the opposite. In this case, they gave me the job that I'd asked for. And so I wound up spending my last 2 years, or almost 3 years in the Army, 2 years in the Army, working with the Mass National Guard as a regular Army advisor. And at the same time, I was able to go to night school to get my graduate degree from Northeastern University, which I did in '72, just as I was leaving the Army.
So that time with the Mass National Guard, was that full-time during the day and then you just did nights, or?
Yes, pretty much full-time. Sometimes I could sneak out at lunch and catch a course, but typically I did all of my schooling at night.
And did the government pay for that?
Yes, it did, under the GI Bill.
Okay.
Not under the government programs that they send officers to, but I filed under the GI Bill, which, as soon as you become a service member, you have that opportunity. And so I paid for it under the GI Bill.
And is that in order to, if the government had paid it directly, or if the military had paid it directly, you would have incurred additional commitment?
Additional commitment. I think it was 2 years for every 1 year of schooling that they would ask for if I had done it, if the Army had sent me.
But under the GI Bill,
No.
you didn't have any additional commitment. Okay, so you had mentioned your son being born. Do you have other children?
Yes, I have my oldest son lives in Shrewsbury and married and divorced and has 2 children. My daughter lives here in town. She actually lives in the house directly in the backyard of the house that she grew up in here in Hopkinton, and is a teacher at the Marathon School, teaches preschool special needs. And then and she has 2 children as well.
But you don't still live in that house that you
No,
grew up.
no,
okay,
no.
so you're not right
No,
next door.
we
so,
live in Shrewsbury
okay,
as well.
so 4 grandchildren, or is that?
And then we have our middle son and his family live down in Dunwoody, Georgia, which is a northern suburb of Atlanta. And they have 3 children and had asked us 10 years ago if we could come, if we would be interested in coming down to Georgia to spend time, get out of the cold. And I had been retired for about 4 or 5 years, and the timing seemed great. So off we went and went down to Georgia and spent 8 years down there. Very enjoyable.
When the grandkids were young?
When the grandkids were very young, I think, and now, and we came back 2 years ago, and now those kids are sophomore in college, one going into her senior year, and the baby is now an 8th grader. So.
And any great-grandchildren?
What's that?
Any great-grandchildren?
No great-grandchildren.
Not yet.
No. The
All
oldest is a sophomore at University of Georgia. Go Dogs! And
Okay.
we enjoyed it down there.
Just wanted, I know we're probably running short, but I just wanted to ask, you had gone to night school, gotten a graduate degree. What was your civilian career?
Well, my civilian career was in the printing industry, and which was, I guess, by choice, but there was a company called Lendman Associates back in the Vietnam era, which is a professional placement outfit, and they had career weekends where you'd go visit them, and then all of the companies that were hiring people, and at the time there were a lot of Vietnam vets, particularly officers, that were getting out of the service and were well educated to do the job in the civilian community. And major companies, Procter & Gamble, Colgate, IBM, and all the big guys were there. And so I interviewed a number of companies and went to a weekend down in Philadelphia while I was still in the Army, just before I got out, and wound up getting offers from a couple of companies, one of which was Procter & Gamble, to go up and make Charmin in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the other was with a company called Container Corporation of America, which was part of Continental Can Company, which is now defunct, and it was making folding cartons, boxes. All your retail boxes that you see in grocery stores are folding cartons, and that's about all I knew about them when I started, and so I got involved with that and wound up doing that as a career. Spent the first 20 years involved with folding cartons, and then in 4 different places, 4 different companies, and wound up coming back to Boston to get involved with the printing industry, doing commercial printing. And we do print circulars, print newspapers, and all the printing companies were under stress, particularly newspapers. They were all dying, and so I hooked myself up with a tough industry, which then wound up with most of the companies that I worked for either were bought or closed.
Sure.
And but it was a good career, and it caused me to earn a living, and also got me back to the Boston area and back to Hopkinton, where I then got involved with local politics.
Well, that's what I was going
And
to ask.
I'm a Republican, which is persona non grata for the most part in the state, and in Hopkinton not so much back then. Back then, I do that caveat. And I involved myself went before the Republican Town Committee and introduced myself and told them what I did and told them I was a townie. And by that time, I wasn't living in, or I just moved back to town. And now I'm a newcomer, so I'm neither fish nor fowl. I'm sort of in between. I'm both a townie and a newcomer. So if there's a rift between them, I'm part of both. And they said, well, we'd like you to run for office then. And I said, well, listen, all of those departments, they require technical knowledge. I really don't know anything. And they said, well, then maybe you should run for selectman.
Yeah.
And I did. And I was fortunate enough to win. And
Fortunate?
and at that time, there were only 3 selectmen. And I served with 2 legends, Penny Manchester and John Hinckley, back in the late 80s. And we were a pretty good group. And it was kinder, gentler time. And it was during my second term as a selectman that we moved to 5 selectmen, which made for more rough and rowdy relationships.
Well, just out of curiosity, not to get in too much trouble, but was that kind of a court packing situation where the people who were kind of out of power at the time wanted to expand the number?
No, not at all. Most of the towns, small towns and towns in general who use boards of select persons were going or had gone to a 5-member board. A 3-member board makes it impossible for there to be any sort of collaboration, selectman to selectman, without violating the open meeting laws.
Okay.
And if 2 selectmen out of 3 got together, that was a violation.
Right.
Back then it was a little bit different, and the laws have changed since then. So going to 5 both enabled there to be some degree of collaboration, because one selectman could collaborate with another on things. You just couldn't have a plurality or a majority getting together.
2 can work together, but not 3.
Not 3. That's correct.
Interesting.
And also when somebody was missing, that would cause a difficulty. And I was traveling a little bit at the time, and I had to try to tailor my travel around selectmen's meetings for the first time. The second time I was on a 5-member board, and it was less of a problem.
Okay. Anything else that I might have missed that you wanted to mention?
Geez, I can't think of anything, Ted. I've maintained my relationship as a member of the Hopkinton American Legion, and have been active in that for years. Even when I moved up to Shrewsbury, and where I live on Lake Quinsigamon, directly across the lake from UMass Medical, which we have really enjoyed living there. And we lived there both before we went to Georgia, and then after we went to Georgia, we moved back there, which is where I live now. But we still have deep roots, and Judy being a Bowker, she's got a brother and nephews and a niece and nephew here, and I've got lots of friends here in town that I come to visit, and so we're still Hopkintonians, even though we haven't lived here for a while.
And I should thank you for all of your time spent as the host of Veterans Remember. I think that was a wonderful service, and thank you for that.
That was the most enjoyable thing, and thanks to both Mike Terosian and Hank. Hank Alessio is the one who really was the brainchild about this, and he tapped into me because I was a townie, and because I knew a lot of people in the town, and he hoped that I could help get townies to come and be interviewed. And at the time, many of those World War II veterans were people I knew growing up. They were the parents of my friends. And it made it, I guess easier isn't the right word, but it made it comfortable for me to spend time talking with the parents of my friends. And we immediately decided that we were going to rush through as many of the World War II veterans as we could find in Hopkinton, because at that time they were dying, I think it was 1,000 a day.
Wow.
And so we did, and we must have gotten 30, 40 interviews in of World War II vets. We completed and got them in the can down to the Library of Congress. All of those veterans that we interviewed then have since passed on. So I think it's Veterans Remember was really a service, and I'm so glad that it continues on today. And I applaud you for getting involved, and thank you very much for interviewing me.
Being volunteered. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dick.